So now that our input manager is able to take inputs from Unity and convert them into buttons that our game can use, we're going to need a place to store whether the button has been pressed or released. To get started, let's go back into our projects folder, and in scripts, we're going to create a new C# script called input state. Open it up in MonoDevelop, and we'll begin adding the code. Now, just like we did with our input manager, we're going to need a special class in order to keep track of the actual button state itself. Above our input state, let's create this new class. We'll make it a public class called button state. Now, since we're not going to be changing this in the IDE, we don't need to worry about serializing the object. All we need to do is have a boolean that keeps track of whether the button is pressed or not. We'll make this a public boolean called value. Next, in our input state, we're going to need to keep a collection of all the button states in our game. In order to do this, we're going to use a dictionary. The key will be our button's enum, and the value will be the button state class. Let's bring in the generic collections so that we can use the dictionary in our own class. Next, inside of the input state, we'll create our dictionary. The key is going to be our button's enum, and the value, our button state. And we'll call this button states. And let's instantiate this inline. Now, in order for the input manager to set the values, we're going to need to create a public method. We'll call this method setButtonValue. We'll pass in a reference to the button enum as the key, and a boolean for the value of whether the key is pressed or released. Now, before we can actually set a value in the dictionary, we need to make sure that the key exists. We can use the dictionary's contains_key method to check on the key that's being passed into the method. If we see that the key doesn't exist in the dictionary, we're going to add it, and we'll create a new button state to go with it. Now we're able to set the value of the actual state. We'll need to get a reference to it from the dictionary, and then we'll need to set it. Now we need a way of connecting the input manager to the input state. Let's open up our input manager and create a property for that. In the input manager class, we'll create a new public property for input state, and we'll call this input state. Now, we can replace our for loop with, instead of testing if the value is true and debugging, we can actually just tell the input state what the value of that key is. As you can see, we're now looping through all the inputs that have been mapped on the input manager and passing those values directly into the input state, and we're using the button enum as a way of abstracting which button is actually pressed. Now, let's go back into Unity, and on our quad, we're going to add the input state. Next, in the input manager, you'll see that we have an input state here that's empty. Let's drag the quad over to that, and now the input manager will directly manipulate the quad's input state. We can test that this works by going back into the input state, and in the update loop, we can log out the values of each button press. Here, we'll loop through each of the button states and put this into the console. In order to loop through the dictionary, we're going to need to use a key-value pair. Here, we'll type it to buttons and button state just like our dictionary is. We'll call each instance a state in our button states, and now we can log out the value of each key press. One thing to note is that since we're using the key-value pair, we'll receive the key, which is the button, but in this case, we also get a value back, and our button state has a value as well. So we'll write state.value.value. We save this, go back into Unity, and if we run the game, we'll now see in the console window that right and left are false. If we give focus to the game window and hold down the right key, you'll see that it's true, and then it returns back to false when it's released. Next, we'll want a cleaner way of actually knowing when a button is released and tracking things like how long a button's actually been pressed, which may be useful down the line.